My name is Claire. I am 28 years old, and I work as a licensed social worker. Last spring, I attended Marcus's parents' anniversary dinner. I wore a simple navy dress and told myself to stay calm. But halfway through the meal, his sister stood up, gestured toward me, and laughed in front of everyone. "That's Marcus's girlfriend," she announced to the whole table. "She's just a social worker. Don't worry, she means well." A few people smiled politely. I didn't say a word. I just kept my hands folded in my lap and breathed slowly. But then an older woman sitting 3 seats down stopped mid-conversation and turned to look at me. Her expression changed in a way I couldn't quite read. She set down her wine glass very carefully and leaned slightly forward, studying my face like she was trying to place something she hadn't thought about in a long time. Before I tell you what happened next, my name is Claire, and this is the story of the night I learned that quiet work has a way of speaking for itself. Marcus and I had been together for almost 2 years when his parents announced the dinner. Robert and Linda were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary, and they wanted the whole family together. Not just immediate family either. They had invited extended relatives, old neighbors, and a few longtime family friends who had known them since their early married years. It was going to be a full table, maybe 30 people, at a private dining room in one of those quietly expensive restaurants where everything on the menu sounds simple but nothing is under $40. Marcus told me about the dinner on a Tuesday evening while we were cooking together in his apartment. He sounded casual about it, the way he always tried to sound casual when something made him a little nervous. He stirred the pasta and said, "By the way, Mom and Dad want you to come to the anniversary thing next Saturday." His voice was steady, but he wasn't looking at me. I knew what that meant. I had heard enough about his family to understand the weight of that invitation. His parents were kind people, genuinely warm and unpretentious. But his older sister Vanessa was a different matter. She was 36, ran her own real estate development firm, drove a car that cost more than 2 years of my salary, and had very clear opinions about what a serious person looked like. According to Marcus, she had never said anything directly unkind about me, but she had never seemed particularly impressed either. She had once asked him, without any real curiosity in her voice, what exactly a social worker does all day. I said yes to the dinner without hesitating. I wasn't going to let anxiety about Vanessa make me miss something important to Marcus. The restaurant was in a suburb about 40 minutes outside the city, tucked behind a row of old oak trees at the end of a quiet road. When Marcus and I walked in that Saturday evening, the private dining room was already filling up. Round tables had been arranged in a wide horseshoe shape, covered in white linen, with small flower arrangements in soft orange and gold. Someone had placed framed photographs of Robert and Linda along a side table. Their wedding photo, their kids as children, family vacations from decades past. I spent a few minutes looking at those photographs while Marcus went to find his parents. There was something peaceful about them. They were just ordinary moments, barbecues and beach trips and Christmas mornings, but all lined up together like that, they told a whole life. Linda found me first. She came across the room with both hands extended and pulled me into a hug that felt completely genuine. "I'm so glad you're here," she said quietly. "Marcus talks about you constantly." I smiled and told her congratulations, and she squeezed my hands before someone else called her name, and she turned away. Robert shook my hand warmly and told me Marcus had made a very good choice, which made me laugh. I found a seat toward the middle of the table, between Marcus and one of his cousins I had met briefly once before. The room filled up slowly. Relatives greeted each other loudly, hugging and commenting on who had grown or changed. There was the comfortable noise of a family that knew each other well. Vanessa arrived about 15 minutes after us. She came in with her husband, a quiet man named Greg, who mostly smiled and nodded, and immediately the energy of the room organized itself around her without her seeming to try. She was tall and confident in a way that looked entirely natural. She wore a dark burgundy dress and small gold earrings, and she greeted people with the easy assurance of someone who had never spent much time wondering whether she was welcome anywhere. She looked at me when she reached our end of the table. "Hey Claire," she said pleasantly. Then she moved on to hug Marcus and didn't say anything else. The dinner began. Salads were brought out, wine was poured, and the room settled into the warm hum of people enjoying themselves. Robert stood up early in the meal to say a few words about Linda, and his voice got thick near the end, which made several people at the table reach for their napkins quietly. Linda covered her face with one hand and laughed and cried at the same time. I felt something warm move through my chest watching them. 35 years. That kind of love doesn't happen by accident. It happens because two people keep choosing it, over and over, through the ordinary difficult business of being alive together. After Robert sat down, the conversation broke back into smaller pieces around the table. I talked with Marcus's cousin about her kids. I talked with an older neighbor of his parents about the neighborhood and how much it had changed. I felt comfortable, relaxed, even. I thought the evening might pass without anything remarkable happening. Then the main courses arrived, and Vanessa stood up. She tapped her fork against her glass the way people do when they want a room's attention, and the conversations around the table quieted. Vanessa smiled and said she wanted to say something. Just a small thing, before everyone got too deep into their food. She talked about her parents for a minute, said some genuinely lovely things about how they had raised her and Marcus and what their home had felt like growing up. People nodded and smiled. Then she said, speaking of family, I want to take a second and introduce someone because I know not everyone here has met Marcus's girlfriend yet. She looked at me. I felt the familiar tightening in my stomach, but I kept my expression open and calm. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table. Vanessa gestured in my direction with her wine glass. This is Claire, she said warmly. She's been with Marcus for, almost 2 years now? She paused in a way that felt slightly too long. She's a social worker. She works with, what is it exactly, at-risk families. She looked at me with an expression that was politely interested in the way that a person is politely interested in something they consider minor. She means well, Vanessa added with a small laugh, and her husband Greg laughed softly beside her. And 2 or 3 other people smiled in the way people smile when they're not sure if something is funny, but feel the social gravity pulling them to respond. There it was. She does good work, I'm sure, in her small, quiet corner of the world. She means well. I kept my face neutral. I had learned, through years of sitting across from people in their worst moments, how to hold my expression still when I needed to. I smiled at the table generally and said nothing. But then I heard it. A sound from down the table. Not a word exactly, just a soft intake of breath, the kind a person makes when something catches them off guard. I looked down the table toward the sound. There was an older woman 3 seats away whom I hadn't spoken to yet. She had silver white hair cut cleanly at her jaw, and she was wearing a pale blue blouse and small pearl earrings. She had been laughing at something with the man beside her just a moment ago, but now she was very still. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not recognition exactly, something more like the beginning of recognition. Like a word on the tip of your tongue. I looked away and reached for my water glass. But when I glanced back a moment later, she was still watching me. Marcus leaned close to my ear. You okay? He said quietly. I'm fine, I told him. And I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly hurt. What I felt, sitting there at that table while the conversation moved on and plates were set in front of everyone, was a familiar tiredness. Not bitterness, just tiredness. The kind that comes from spending years doing work that most people don't think about until they desperately need it. I had chosen social work when I was 22, during my last year of college. I had grown up in a house where things were not always stable. Not dramatic, not the kind of story people make movies about, just the ordinary kind of instability that doesn't get a name. There were years when my mother worked 2 jobs and the lights still got shut off sometimes. There were years when I didn't know what was happening with the adults in my house, and no one explained it to me, and I would lie awake at night listening and trying to understand. There was no one official whose job it was to check on us. We were fine, mostly. But I always remembered what it felt like to be a child in a situation you couldn't control, waiting for someone to notice. So I became the person who notices. I worked for the County Child Welfare Agency. My caseload at any given time was somewhere between 15 and 25 families. I drove to apartments and buildings with broken elevator buttons and houses where the front steps were soft with rot. I sat in kitchens and living rooms and sometimes in my car in parking lots, and I tried to figure out what was true and what a child needed and what I could actually do about it within the limits of what the system would allow, which was often not enough. I wrote reports that took hours. I showed up on nights and weekends when things got urgent. I drove children to emergency foster placements at 11 o'clock at night. I sat in waiting rooms at the hospital and at the courthouse, and I held the hands of kids who were terrified and exhausted and didn't know what was going to happen to them. I never talked about it much outside of work. Not because I was ashamed. Because most of the time people would listen politely for 30 seconds and then change the subject, and after a while, it becomes easier to just let them. The main course was a choice between salmon and chicken, and the conversation around the table moved into a comfortable phase, the kind where everyone is eating, and the noise level drops slightly, and smaller conversations break off in pairs and threes. Vanessa was talking to someone across from her about a new development project her firm was working on. Marcus was talking to his father. I was talking with the cousin again, whose name was Jess, about a hiking trail she had just done in Utah that she said was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. I was genuinely enjoying the conversation, but I was also aware, at the edge of my attention, that the older woman in the pale blue blouse was still glancing at me. After a while, I saw her lean toward the woman beside her and say something quietly. The other woman looked at me briefly and then back at her companion and shrugged slightly, as if to say, "I don't know, ask her yourself." The older woman seemed to make a decision. She waited for a pause in the conversations around her, and then she spoke, just loud enough for the nearby part of the table to hear. "Excuse me," she said, looking directly at me. "I'm sorry to interrupt." I leaned forward slightly. "Yes?" I said. She smiled carefully. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "I'm an old friend of Robert and Linda's. We go back about 20 years. She paused. "I heard that young woman say you're a social worker." "That's right," I said. Eleanor nodded slowly. She was turning something over in her mind. I could see it in her face. "Would you happen to work with the county?" she asked. "The Child Welfare Division?" Something in my chest shifted slightly. "Yes," I said carefully. "I have for about 5 years." Eleanor exhaled. She put one hand flat on the table, as if steadying herself. Her eyes were very clear and very direct. She said, and she said it slowly, like each word mattered. "A little over 3 years ago. A little girl named Maya." The room was still mostly carrying on its own conversations. Vanessa was still talking. The cousin Jess had turned to say something to the person on her other side. Marcus was laughing at something his father had said. But at our end of the table, something had gone very quiet. I looked at Eleanor carefully. "I don't discuss case details," I said gently. "I hope you understand." She nodded quickly. "Oh, I know," she said. "I know you can't, but I need to ask." She looked down at her plate for just a moment, then back up at me. "Were you the one who came to the apartment on Garfield Street? In October, 3 years ago? On a Tuesday night?" My heart was very still inside my chest. There are cases you carry with you. Not all of them. You can't carry all of them, or you will break. But some of them stay. Some of them live permanently in the part of your memory that opens unexpectedly at night or in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Maya was one of those. I had received the call on a Tuesday evening in October. A neighbor had reported concerns. I drove out to an apartment building on Garfield Street, one of those buildings where the hallway lights were always half working and it smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner. I knocked on the door. A woman answered. Behind her, in the dim hallway of the apartment, I saw a small girl, 4 years old, sitting on the floor against the wall. She had a stuffed rabbit in her lap, and she was very still, and she looked at me with the particular eyes of a child who has learned to be invisible. I spent that night making calls, writing emergency documentation, driving across the city, sitting in a fluorescent hallway at 2 in the morning filling out paperwork so that Maya could go somewhere safe. I found out later that the woman who had raised her grandmother had been searching for months for information about where Maya had gone, because the system had lost her contact information in a transfer. It had taken over a year for the grandmother to locate her granddaughter through the courts. I had never met the grandmother. I had only ever met Maya. I looked at Eleanor, sitting across the candlelight in her pale blue blouse and pearl earrings. "I can't confirm details," I said again, but more quietly this time. Eleanor's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "That's all right," she said. "You don't need to. I know it was you. My daughter told me the name of the caseworker. Claire. She told me a woman named Claire came that night. She said that if that woman hadn't come when she did, and done what she did, as fast as she did, Maya might not have gotten out of that apartment." By this point, the conversation at the nearby end of the table had slowed. Marcus had turned. His mother had turned. The cousin Jess had gone quiet. Eleanor reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the corner of her eye. "Maya is 7 now," she said. "She lives with my daughter, her aunt. She goes to school. She has friends. She sleeps in a room with a yellow lamp, and she has a cat named Button." Eleanor smiled, even as her voice went unsteady. "Last month, she lost her first tooth. She made my daughter call me at 10 o'clock at night to tell me." I could hear her laughing in the background. The table was very quiet now. I felt something move through me that was too large to name. I looked down at the tablecloth for a moment, and then back up at Eleanor. "I'm so glad," I said softly. "I'm genuinely so glad to hear that." Eleanor shook her head. She looked at me with an expression I recognized from the hardest moments of my work. The expression of someone who needs to say something true and important and knows that no words are actually enough. "You changed a child's life," she said. "You came at night. You stayed. You did every single thing that needed to be done, and you did it without anyone thanking you. My daughter tried to find you afterward to tell you herself, but by then you had been reassigned and the agency couldn't give out your contact information." She paused. "I have wanted to thank you for 3 years," she said. "And here you are." The dining room was silent now in the way that large rooms get silent when something real is happening in them. Not the silence of awkwardness, but the silence of people who are paying genuine attention. Marcus was looking at me. His expression was open and a little stunned in the way that people look when they realize they are seeing something important about a person they love that they didn't fully understand before. His mother, Linda, had both hands pressed together in front of her face. Robert had set down his fork. And Vanessa. I didn't look at Vanessa directly at first. But then I did. She was sitting very still in her chair. Her wine glass was on the table in front of her. The confident ease that she had carried through the entire evening had gone somewhere. She looked smaller somehow, and very focused on the middle distance. Eleanor composed herself and reached down the table toward me. I extended my hand, and she took it in both of hers. Her hands were warm and dry. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for that little girl." I pressed her hands gently. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Genuinely. We don't always get to hear how things turn out. Marcus's mother made a sound and reached for a napkin. His father cleared his throat quietly. After a moment, Marcus spoke. His voice was measured, but his eyes were bright. "Claire never told me any of this," he said to the table. "Not because it isn't meaningful, because she never makes it about herself." One of the older guests near the far end of the table, a woman I didn't know, shook her head slowly and said, "What a thing! What a thing!" I saw Jess look at Vanessa with an expression that was very hard to misread. Vanessa finally looked up. Her eyes moved to me and then away. She was turning her fork slowly in her fingers. Her husband, Greg, was looking at the table. She opened her mouth once and closed it again. Then she said, very quietly, "I didn't know." No one said anything for a moment. I looked at her. "I know you didn't," I said. "It's all right." And I meant it. I wasn't angry at Vanessa. I never had been, not really. She lived in a world where value was legible. You could read it in the title, in the salary, in the office address. The work I did wasn't legible in that way. It happened in hallways and parking lots and at 2 in the morning, and it didn't leave a visible mark. Most of the people who benefited from it were children who couldn't speak for themselves and families that the rest of the world preferred not to think about. I understood why someone like Vanessa had looked at me and seen something small and peripheral. Understanding it didn't make it painless, but it didn't make me angry either. Eleanor released my hands, but she was still looking at me. She said, "You know what I have always thought about people who do your kind of work." I shook my head. She said, "I think it takes a very particular kind of courage. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind people notice. The kind that gets up every day and goes back into difficult places and holds on to difficult things and keeps going anyway, without anyone watching. That, she said, is not small. That is one of the hardest things a human being can do. The table remained quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then Robert, Marcus's father, picked up his wine glass. He looked down the table at me with an expression that was warm and direct. He said, "I think this calls for something." He raised his glass. He said, "To the people who show up when it matters." Quietly, without asking for recognition. He looked at Eleanor, to you for finding her and saying what needed to be said. And to Claire, he said, "For that little girl." The table raised their glasses. I raised mine too, though my hand wasn't entirely steady. Marcus leaned over and put his arm around my shoulders, and I let myself lean into him for just a moment. The rest of the evening was different in a way that was hard to precisely describe. The food was the same. The music playing softly from the speakers in the corner was the same. But the room had rearranged itself somehow. People I hadn't spoken to before came over during dessert and introduced themselves properly and asked genuine questions. 2 women told me about family members who had worked in social services and what they had seen those people go through. An older man shook my hand and said his grandson had had a rough few years and that the people at the county office had made a real difference, and he had never gotten to say thank you to any of them. Eleanor stayed through the end of the dinner. Before she left, she found me near the door and pressed a small piece of paper into my hand with her phone number written on it. She said, "My daughter would give anything to thank you in person. If you are ever willing, there is no obligation, but the offer will always be there." I folded the paper carefully and put it in my small bag. Vanessa approached me near the end of the night while Marcus was saying goodbye to relatives. She walked over without her husband, without her usual ease, and she stood in front of me with her arms at her sides. Her expression was serious and unguarded in a way I had not seen from her before. She said, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was dismissive, and it was wrong. I said it without thinking, and that's not an excuse." I looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," I said honestly. She shook her head slightly. "I had no idea what you actually do," she said. "I mean, I think I thought I knew, but I didn't." She paused. "What Eleanor said tonight. I keep thinking about that little girl in that apartment." She stopped. I said, "Most people don't think about it. That's not a criticism. There's no reason you would think about it if it has never touched your life." Vanessa was quiet for a second. Then she said, "It has touched my life. It apparently touched my family's life, through you, without my knowing it, through someone I dismissed in front of a room full of people." She looked directly at me. "I'm sorry, Claire." I told her I accepted the apology and I meant it. She nodded once, carefully, and then went back to find her husband. Marcus drove us home through the dark suburban roads, the highway gradually giving way to the city lights, and we didn't talk much for the first part of the drive. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights and thought about Maya with her stuffed rabbit. I thought about the yellow lamp in her room and the cat named Button and the lost tooth and the aunt who got a phone call at 10 o'clock at night from a 7-year-old too excited to wait until morning. I thought about Eleanor sitting in her pale blue blouse turning to look at me across the dinner table, and how a moment that I had carried inside myself for 3 years, alone, in the silent way that workers like me carry things, I had suddenly found its completion in a restaurant dining room in the suburbs on a Saturday evening. When I was sitting in a navy dress that I had ironed because I wanted to make a good impression. Life is strange that way. The threads you let go of have a way of finding their ends without you. Marcus reached over in the dark and took my hand. He said, "You never told me about any of that." "I know," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should have." I turned to look at him. He was watching the road, both hands on the wheel now, but his jaw was set in the way it gets when he is feeling something strongly and trying to find the right words for it. "I didn't tell you," I said carefully, "because it's not mine to tell. The children I work with, the families, none of that belongs to me as a story. It belongs to them." He nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "But the rest of it, the work, the nights, what it costs you." I looked back out the window. "I know," I said. "I'll do better." He squeezed my hand once and didn't push further. When we got back to the apartment, I changed out of my dress and sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the quiet. I took the small piece of paper out of my bag and looked at Eleanor's phone number written in her careful, even handwriting. I thought about what it would mean to call her daughter, to sit across from someone who had been on the other side of that October night on Garfield Street, who had spent years looking for the person who had come to the door. I thought about Maya. I put the paper on my nightstand. I would call. There is a kind of work that the world doesn't look at directly. Not because the world is cruel, but because it is uncomfortable to look at the places where things have broken down, at the children sitting very still against apartment walls, at the families held together by nothing but the people willing to walk in and try. Most people live their lives at a safe distance from those places. They know, in the abstract, that someone is handling it. They just don't think too hard about who or what it takes. I don't need them to think about it. I didn't become a social worker for recognition. I became one because I remembered what it felt like to be a child in a situation I didn't understand, waiting for someone to notice. But sometimes the world notices anyway, in a restaurant on a Saturday night, in the voice of a grandmother holding your hand and saying thank you across a candlelit table. Sometimes the quiet work finds its witness. And when it does, it doesn't feel like vindication. It doesn't feel like victory over anyone. It just feels like the long, slow confirmation that it mattered. That it always mattered. That every difficult night and every hard drive and every report written in exhaustion and every child placed in a safe bed somewhere was a thread in something real. Something that holds. You never know who is in the room. And you never know what a small act of faithfulness, done without an audience, in the unlit places where most people never go, has set in motion in someone else's life. Do the work anyway. Show up anyway. Stay. Because somewhere, years from now, there is a little girl with a cat named Button who grew up in a yellow-lit room instead of on a floor in the dark. And that is not nothing. That is everything.